Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2018 Hack Summit. We are now on day 3, and we've had a fantastic first 2 days of Hack Summit where we learned all about scalable blockchains, we learned about crypto gaming, we learned from some of the biggest and most important foundations in this space, and it's been truly educational for all of us. And I am very, very privileged to introduce day 3 to us, and we're going to have an all-star, rock-star lineup of speakers for you today. So hang in there. It's going to be an awesome day. And at the end of the day today, we're going to be announcing the winners of the hackathon as well. And for our first speaker, we are super privileged to be here with Brian Behlendorf, who is the executive director of the Linux Foundation's Hyperledger project. And just to let you know a little bit more about Brian, he was back in the day a primary developer for the Apache web server, which is the most popular web server on the internet right now. And he also was a founding member of the Apache group, which later became the Apache Software Foundation, which is a very significant organization that's impacted all of us, including myself. And he was president of Apache Software for 3 years. He then was on the board of Mozilla, as well as the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who we're fundraising for this week at Hack Summit. And he was also named one of the top 100 innovators in the world by MIT Technology Review. And he was CTO of the World Economic Forum. Brian, it's such a privilege to have you here. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So this is going to be just a fun fireside chat between myself and Brian. And you guys should feel free to jump in and ask questions during the event. You can do that at the bottom of the screen. There's an Ask a Question button where you can ask questions of Brian, and we'll try to get to those later. And Brian, if you want to ask our audience some questions, we can do that too. We can ask kind of multiple choice yes or no questions or multiple choice questions to find out more about our audience if you want to do that too.
Sure.
So so maybe think about that a little bit. And why don't we start off a little bit talking about the project Hyperledger, which is your current responsibility as executive director. So tell me more a little bit about the problem that Hyperledger is trying to solve in the world. What is the genesis of it, and what did you notice in the world that caused you guys to create the Hyperledger project?
Yeah. Well, telling you a little bit about Hyperledger can't be done without telling you a little bit about the Linux Foundation, which most people think of Linux. They think of what's running inside Android phones. They think of what's running inside of like their Wi-Fi base stations, right? But Linux today is inside of cars. It's inside of telco switch hardware. It's inside of a lot of different industrial gear out there, and all 500 of the top 500 supercomputers on the planet. And we kind of have this image of like Linus Torvalds as a student publishing his first version to Usenet in 1991. But by about 2001, what was really needed as that community grew was an organization that could sit at the heart of that community as kind of a neutral ground between all the developers, helping them coordinate their efforts better, providing a place to run, initially the BitKeeper repositories that eventually get the Git repositories, of course, but also to help make sure that like the legal ground is covered, to help figure out just enough process to help make sure that the devs felt like their work was being respected, their work could be channeled in the right way. And now, 25 years after Linus Torvalds released that first little version, it's still running in all these places, and it still sees 10,000 new lines of code every day, right? Which is an incredible statistic for something that is that old. The reason it works is that the Linux Foundation has figured out this model for how to support those kinds of communities by paying people to do kind of the essential air traffic control, to run kind of the conference calls and the infrastructure for development, basically, but then also help keep the companies from fighting too viciously with each other, right? How do you build a movement where you need these companies to help invest in it and help move it further, to write a lot of the code inside the Linux kernel and the operating system and these other things, but how do you keep them from wanting to turn it into Red Hat, exclusively Linux, right? Or IBM exclusively Linux, right? And so there's an equal amount of like negotiation and diplomacy and messaging with the companies as well. And then training and then doing events and all the kinds of things that you need to do to get from great software to actual broad adoption and movement, right? And a couple of years ago, this community, the Linux Foundation, realized that there were other adjacent technology domains to get into: cloud computing, software-defined networking, software inside automobiles. So projects like CNCF, which is the home for Kubernetes, were launched, and about 40 different projects now that live at the Linux Foundation that all have adopted this model of have just enough staff at the center to act as, again, these kind of like facilitators and to deal with the vendors and kind of grow the commercial ecosystem, but really leave the open source development up to the developers to decide what's the right place to take these technologies. And so about 2.5 years ago, as Bitcoin was taking off, as Ethereum was still kind of coming together, there were a group of people who said, well, cryptocurrencies are one interesting application of blockchain technology, but there's a deeper history here of how to build distributed systems, how to build consensus networks around databases, how to do all these kinds of things that all of which can be modernized, all of which have things to learn from Satoshi and Vitalik and all the other intellectual firepower being applied in the cryptocurrency space. But maybe there are ways to apply those in other applications where you might not need a token to fund the consensus mechanism, or where tokenization can happen as an application on top. And so a bunch of the existing companies involved with the Linux Foundation, like Intel and IBM, started to come together around, here's some code that we already have in the labs that might solve these kinds of challenges, these kind of questions, right? And then other new wave companies like Digital Asset and R3, and then these stodgy old companies like JP Morgan or Fujitsu or other banks. Basically, we pulled them together into a project. And I can't say we at that point. I didn't join until a few months after the launch of Hyperledger. I was at a venture capital firm at the time, and for me, Hyperledger represented kind of a fresh take on the blockchain space. For me, it was a way out of proof of work, and I know there's a lot of fans of proof of work out there, so I know this is perhaps controversial, but for a lot of people, the energy consumption issue was kind of a non-starter, right? And within Hyperledger, we found that there's all these other consensus mechanisms available to do really interesting development, and a lot of more prosaic kind of needs. We're not there to kind of say you don't need the banks anymore, you don't need governments anymore. We're not like going out to a desert island and trying to turn it into a utopia kind of thing. We're here to try to say there's existing marketplaces that if you had a blockchain, and for us, what blockchain means a distributed ledger and a smart contract system. And if you have those two pieces, you can take a lot of existing applications, a lot of existing marketplaces, and keep them from going where I think the trend was heading them, which is that in each of these markets, you'd end up with with like an Uber or an eBay or a PayPal at the center of those markets, right? Or a Facebook at the center of those markets. And that might be okay for like things like social networking, but it's definitely not okay if you're talking about the global banking networks or you're talking about supply chains all over the place, right? Like when you're talking about real tokens of value, you want it a few steps more decentralized than you would end up with. And I'll just end with, where we've gotten to has been the development of a lot of different technologies and frameworks and tools to be able to build these kinds of distributed, decentralized networks that you can use to store digital assets, that you can use to automate processes that are fundamentally about avoiding needing somebody in the center to play God.
It's very well said. And just to echo what you said there, if you've read in the news recently, I'm sure you've seen that, for example, Ripple has received a lot of criticism for their global banking network and having, so much of their tokens, 60-70% under their control over such a long period of time. It sounds decentralized, but it's not quite truly decentralized when all that power rests within Ripple. And so, I think the banks have pushed back a little bit on adoption as a result of that. And so it's to your point about how, there really shouldn't be a centralized steward here. We should have a decentralized network. And so I admire the product that you're working on. That's fantastic.
And there's degrees of decentralization too. I mean, I think Ripple was a substantial advance over Swift, right? Over kind of some of the previous examples. They do still, like if there's a spectrum, they're very much closer to the centralized side of that spectrum than say something with Ethereum. But I tend to tell friends who are way over here on like the other end of the blockchain space and the cryptocurrency space, think of us as building a gateway drug. Right. If we can get enterprises comfortable with the idea of letting go of their control a little bit over processes, over technology platforms, of being a tad more, I don't want to say public, because a lot of this is about enabling these kind of permissioned organizations, but being more comfortable with the idea of consensus mechanisms, of exchanges where you may win value one day and lose value another day, right? And if they can do that, then they might be more open to even more radical decentralization. Because I think Metcalfe's law still applies. I think the value of a network is still somewhere around the square of the number of nodes, perhaps up to some limit, as we've discovered with the internet. But still, the bigger the network, the better. And the cryptocurrency communities have kind of started way out here and said, let's make it as big as absolutely possible. And you got to respect that. And the characteristics of smart contracts and consensus mechanisms are very hard problems at those levels. It turns out if you find, you really want to enable a 20 bank network to be able to send wires between each other, or a 30 participant supply chain in the diamond industry, not only are there faster algorithms, there's and more things you can play with. You can solve problems today and get people comfortable with that. And then we can see where it leads.
That's great. Very well said. And so tell us a little bit more about Hyperledger. So what is the project about? What are some of the major modules in it? Help get our audience up to speed in case they don't know what it is right now.
So it's best to think of Hyperledger the way that you might think of Apache, right? And in the early days, Apache was synonymous with the web server product, right? People would say, oh, I'm running Apache. But from about 1998 onward, we had a nonprofit called the Apache Software Foundation. And the community of projects that we started to attract. I mean, we kind of figured out how to have a developer community focused on one product, and then scale that by having lots of additional communities that all came together with a couple of common principles, what's often called the Apache way, right? The same software license, the same process for getting developer sign-off of their contributions coming in, the same idea that all the development is public, and that it's all done very visibly, and that anybody could be a contributor. You could be 15 years old, living in Shenzhen, and you should be able to become a core contributor on a project. And so Hyperledger as a whole is a community of these projects, and there's 10 of them there. Some of them are names that might be familiar, like Fabric and Sawtooth and Quilt and Indy, and all those are frameworks. Actually, Quilt is the tool, but Indy and Sawtooth and Fabric are frameworks for building distributed ledger applications. If we were doing a DLT between a network of 20 banks, each of those banks would stand up a instance of Fabric. All those 20 banks would point it at a common certificate authority, because that's what kind of binds everybody onto the same network. And then they would start churning transactions. They start broadcasting transactions to each other. And so we have about 5 of these frameworks total, and then 5 additional tools. We can always add additional projects. It's really up to the community and the public process that we have around adding additional ones. But the idea is that these are a curated portfolio of different projects that differ in some important ways, but they might also overlap and compete in some other ways. Both Fabric and Sawtooth can be used to do a lot of the same kinds of blockchain blockchain projects. And that can be a challenge to describe the differences, the same way somebody who's just starting out working with databases might be a bit puzzled by the differences between something like MySQL and Cassandra, right? They're both databases. I could use them to build almost anything, but why would I use one rather than the other? In fact, we're still kind of learning why would you use one rather than the other. But that's kind of the high level point of why you would use Fabric or Sawtooth or Iroha or Indy or Burrow, which is actually more of our Ethereum client. It's an implementation of the Ethereum smart contract engine running on top of a Tendermint consensus mechanism. But now people have taken that Ethereum VM and plugged it into Sawtooth and into Fabric. So we're trying to be a bridge in that way. And that's kind of the point of the overall effort, is try to map the solution space with a lot of different options. Try to invite other projects to come in. And when a project comes in, really try to make it both enterprise quality, make sure there's multiple developers involved, multiple companies behind a project. So you never have to worry if a meteor hits, San Jose, or a meteor hits Armonk, New York, right? And the companies behind some of these projects disappear. Well, what happens to the project? They should be able to keep going, right? And that's what we're aiming for all of the projects at Hyperledger.
That's great. And so tell me about the tangible benefits that the community receives as a result of the existence of Hyperledger. So you're creating almost a brand and a standard around these projects. Yeah. What is the impact of that in terms of how it benefits enterprises and end developers?
So there's one layer of that of an answer to that question, which is what is the benefit of blockchain technology in general, right? And I'm sure your developers have been like churning on this already, so I don't have to spend as much time here as elsewhere. They know that you can take almost any use case in blockchain technology and solve it with a centralized database. It'll be faster, it'll be cheaper. There's almost no reason not to do it with a central database, except no one wants to have to trust that central database. And so this is a way to tease that apart. And so through these different technologies, you can build these kind of decentralized systems. But the value that we're hoping to provide to the blockchain industry is a different question. Like right now, we have this explosion of all these different platforms, right? We have a lot of different approaches to smart contracts. We have a lot of different approaches to consensus mechanisms, to underlying data structures like the DAG or, consensus mechanism research is actually a pretty hot topic right now. And we kind of feel like it's way too early to necessarily stand up and say there's one true architecture, and if everybody just got on it, we would have this bright, glorious future. We think what's important is to say, let's support all these different efforts. Let's find ways to get close, even with people who are doing something dramatically different than us, right? Like bringing in an Ethereum virtual machine engine and sitting it next to these other platforms. And let's have, a common software license, a common development methodology. Let's help enterprises get comfortable with these tools and how we build them and how they can get involved in the development. And then if it turns out that there are certain architectures that just objectively turn out better and have better developer communities around them and just have more momentum, well, that's like Darwin in action, sort of, right? And they can go forward. And the ones that are lesser, either they specialize and they kind of keep their own kind of momentum, or people kind of bring their projects and their use cases and whatever unique functionality they have over to the more successful projects. And so we can be helpful, I think, when inevitably we go from Cambrian explosion to kind of Darwinian kind of competition and winnowing, because either it'll get pretty vicious between all these different stacks and technologies out there and people slugging it out and wars of attrition, or we can decide to start working together. The 90% common functionality between two different public ledgers or between a public ledger project and a private ledger project, why don't we work on common code that we can build on top of and then spare more of our time and resources and effort on the parts that are truly different?
That's very well said. Thank you. And so tell me about how you think Hyperledger fits into the ecosystem compared to, for example, Ethereum or Ripple or R3. Are you guys competing with them? Is it a collaboration? How do you see the ecosystem playing out?
Right. Well, Ripple and R3 are obviously private companies. They're both members of Hyperledger, right? And so Ripple, for example, some developers there had been working on this standard for connecting transactions across different blockchain networks called Interledger. And they've been working with the W3C, and they did some prototype implementations, and they decided they'd like to bring that implementation. They wanted to get more contributors, more developers working on a common implementation of those protocols. So we started the Quilt project, and the implementation of Interledger came over as partly our answer to the question of how do you get interoperability between these different networks out there. So Ripple obviously wants to see people conduct blockchain transactions and then settle them by paying XRP. They benefit from that widespread adoption, right? But it isn't tied to XRP. It could be, you could have settlement in Stellar or other payment platforms over time. I think right now some of the support is more limited, but we'd like to expand that. And then with R3, they have a competitive product called Corda. Corda is very different architecturally. They have a different strategy for how they want to open source that technology, which is fine. We kind of think it's a better approach to try to go multi-vendor with the technology platform and with the development. But they've also looked at other layers. So, for example, Hyperledger Indy, which is a distributed digital identity platform based on these concepts called self-sovereign ID or user-centric ID. They've demonstrated an integration between Corda and Indy at our booth at a couple of conferences, and they build a bunch of demo code and that sort of thing. So, and then finally with Ethereum, we're not really competitive with Ethereum. People will kind of say Hyperledger versus Ethereum out there, and that doesn't make much sense. It's really an and, because there is interesting technology happening in the Ethereum space around smart contract work. And like I said, we built this bridge called Hyperledger Burrow. We're tracking very closely where they're thinking of taking that platform next, whether it's WebASM or other approaches. We're just not involved on the public cryptocurrency side of the Ethereum space, partly because they're handling that very well. And we're watching from the side, how are they going to handle scaling and sharding and those kinds of things. And if we can be supportive with that, then great. But we're not trying to take over that project or necessarily compete directly with it, because I'd kind of say we're focusing more on the enterprise applications, right? So across all three of these, it's like, I don't want to say it's a big tent and kumbaya and all that kind of stuff, but like we need in this space to focus on working together more. And right now the money is easy, the resources are easy, there's a shortage of developer talent, but it feels like each one of us might be able to build these castles in the sky on our own. And I think pretty soon we're going to realize we need to work together more than we have been and start working on duplicative effort less, and combine our efforts more. And so very happy to have those companies and parts of the Ethereum community as well inside of our orbit, so we can all be working together.
That's very well said, and I can echo some of what you said here, because I've been working with enterprises myself for 20 years or so, and I can say with firsthand experience that enterprises tend to be laggards when it comes to adoption of new technologies. And there used to be this old adage back in the day, which was nobody ever got fired for choosing Oracle. And why is that?
Or IBM. It was IBM before that.
Or IBM before that, yeah. And why was that? It's because, it's a trusted brand. People know it. They understand it. It feels safe. There's blessings from many other vendors that they trusted. I could see that within an enterprise. If you're an executive within an enterprise and your job is on the line, and you're making this risky career-making decision to bet on some new crazy technology, and you're raising your hand, you're saying, I'm going to try to get my department to embrace blockchain, for example, right? It probably would help them politically to have the backing of a coalition of vendors that all believe in this technology. So it's almost like a political problem that you're solving for them internally, rather than necessarily a technology problem.
Well, in much the same way that blockchain itself is a technical solution to a political problem. You could even say open source software was kind of that was perhaps a political solution to a technical problem. But open source was also kind of disruptive. It was kind of about how do we kind of, hold hands and work on something together. And it was impossibly idealistic to be talking about in the late 90s. And everybody thought, enterprise software meant big systems and complex, enterprise application engines and that sort of thing. And you had a lot of companies that were building Java runtime systems that cost millions of dollars, had high license fees and an army of consultants who'd come in and build this for you. And all of that was a waste of time. If we had just worked together better on common Java server engines at the time, and that's eventually what replaced it all, right? That's kind of what developers want too. And especially in a young field where there's a lot that's changing, there's really not a terra firma for a big enterprise company to say, this is what we're going to own exclusively. You need to be working with other companies in this space. And this is like the next iteration after open source software, is tying our systems together in these meaningful business networks.
I agree. I remember back in the early 2000s, there used to be these proprietary application servers where the Java application servers, things like that. There used to be Cold Fusion systems like this. And you had this disparate ecosystem. There was no standard around it. If you were an enterprise and you adopted one of these technologies and that vendor went out of business, or if you decided you want to switch to a different vendor solution, it was very challenging to do that. And then, Java Enterprise Edition came out, J2E, which is what I wrote my book on. And that actually gave rise to this whole ecosystem of vendors agreeing on a certain standard. No. And these days we kind of look back and, we look back at J2EE with, kind of a smile. There's better technologies these days like Go and Rails and things like that, Node.js. But I think it served a purpose, which is to create a standard to make enterprises feel comfortable. Right. That way they would actually embrace the technology. And if you kind of look across the board, I don't know if what you're seeing here, but from my perspective, there's a lot of pilots going on right now with blockchain, right? There aren't as many actual deployments and real world use cases yet of blockchain. And I think that's going to start to evolve over the years. And I think to unlock that, we may need to make enterprises more comfortable with the embracing and the adoption of blockchain. What are you seeing out there in the world? Are you seeing enterprises that are really gung-ho embracing the blockchain? What case studies can we learn from Hyperledger there?
There is a bootstrapping challenge for sure. Like, not only do you have the ordinary challenge of this is a new technology and no one wants to be the first guinea pig and have to discover all the bugs first, right? So they want to wait to see who else is running it and like, have they hit problems or have they had success? But you have this additional complexity, which is the network effect, right? So, you know, like who bought the first fax machine, right? Who sent the first email, right? Like, you kind of need these networks to be built in a way where you have more than just one entity, probably more than two or more than three, all kind of coordinating and saying we have all of the same minimum viable product, all of the same kind of basic use case. Let's all pool $50,000 into a POC together, right? And then see what happens from that. And that's a much harder thing to do than a one company POC or a one company pilot, right? So that's the challenge. And there are business consortia out there, business communities that are starting to realize that their role might be to bring their members together under kind of, let's build some common use cases. Let's perhaps even launch a common network. And then there's new consortia being formed like Mobi, which is this automobile maker and mobility kind of related company, blockchain technology consortium working on, you know, kind of the research and the selling of the idea, but then, you know, eventually we'll get into running pilots and maybe even being the governing entity for a permission ledger or two, right? Mm-hmm. So, and it's funny, this is like consortia technology, like a consortia ledger, all right, is perhaps the better term than permission ledger or even private ledger. This is always going to be about a group of companies. But that's a bootstrapping challenge. Now we're tracking about 40 different production networks that have launched using Hyperledger technologies, which does not sound like a big number at all. It'd be like, wow, 40 apps, 40 websites, that's no big deal. But one of these networks, for example, is a banking network in China. 12 different industrial banks people here have never heard of, that have a network of basically collateral trade network where, you know, when they do their transactions and they have, you know, $5 million that they owe each other, they're going to trade title to an asset, right? So this network has very low volume in terms of numbers of transactions per day, but there's there's $100 billion US in assets being tracked on this network with a couple $1 billion a day in flow between these banks. And that one network alone has as much capital involved as the Bitcoin network. So on these other networks, they won't necessarily be as big. Some of them might not even be about tokens of measurable value. They might simply be about coordinating sensor data off of IoT devices or facilitating the diamond trade, for example. The diamond ledger isn't yet really a titling system around diamonds. All it's doing is tracing the flow of diamonds from where they come out of the ground to where they hit the retail. But they've been using Hyperledger Fabric 2 for about the last year, and they've already tracked millions of diamonds in that process and kept the whole goal. One of the whole reasons to that project was to keep conflict diamonds out of circulation. And so they've already blocked millions of dollars worth of bogus diamonds from entering the market. So there are some real applications of this, and they're hidden. They might not be obvious when they get deployed to end users. This is not going to be a consumer revolution quite the same way as, say, the cryptocurrency thing was. But I hope that consumers feel the difference when, you know, they are in a foreign country and they do a bank withdrawal and it doesn't cost them 8% of the value of the cash they're pulling out just to do the transfer. Or they're doing an international bank wire and it takes 10 minutes to close the confirmation rather than 3 days and costs them 30 cents rather than $30, right? Like there'll be these subtle things, or digital identity, which is, I think, perhaps the biggest consumer-facing change. And there's a lot of moving pieces to this and a lot of hard work on the UI to do, but the whole approach that is enabled by blockchain technology to change the way that identity works away from your information being stored on a big server like at Facebook or Twitter to something that looks more like a cryptocurrency wallet, where you've got your diploma and your driver's license and your healthcare records and other things that you share, or you keep track of who you've shared with, right? That's a revolution in how people manage their personal data. But the world is ready for that now, and that's something that we have an implementation of that at Hyperledger called Hyperledger Indy that is already starting to be piloted out there in some really large scale pilots. Sorry, hiccups. And then just a lot of finally this year, a lot of production momentum that we're seeing. But you know, it's going to be hard to tell where it is. I'll end with this. We don't really have yet a coin market cap for consortia blockchain technologies. We have it for the tokens because you can measure the value of those market caps to 20 decimal points, but you don't have that, and all of them in kind of a big leaderboard, but you don't have that yet for the consortia ledgers out there. Maybe someday you will.
And so on that note, how is Hyperledger monetized? Is there a token? Is there no token? Is there like an enterprise version of these projects that vendors offer? Do you guys make any money off of this? How do you keep the bills paid? Like, maybe get us up to speed on all that.
Sure. Well, I'm not doing this for charity. This is a day job, and it's a day job for all of my staff. And the way we're funded is the same way as all the other Linux Foundation projects, where there's a project like Hyperledger, like Cloud Native Compute Foundation, et cetera. You organize around a particular theme or particular topic, and you go to a set of companies who have a vested interest in this space, and you tell them, look, we'd like you to be a part of this project. We'd like you to financially support this effort. So we'd like you to join as a member, as a sponsoring member of the organization. And for a price that varies from $10,000 to $50,000, we'll put your logo on the website. We'll invite you to some members-only events. We'll have a couple of marketing calls that are members-only. And if you really become a premier member and spend $250K a year, then you can join my governing board, which sets my budget and can fire me. So we make sure to charge enough money for that. But they don't get any special privileges to code. They don't get any special right to veto or make changes or have any influence beyond. It's all a duocracy. The only way that the open source development processes work is if the software developers are driven purely by objective criteria of what's right and wrong, what are we building. As long as it's based on ideas and it's based on persuasion and it's based on doing the work and getting things done, then, and that's kind of managed in parallel or kind of separate to having a supportive membership base, then that works. And you avoid all issues around conflict or around tension or conflict of interest, bias, that sort of thing. But I have to, kind of give this membership a lot of value for its money. And the best way to do that is by building up the best portfolio possible of usable, enterprise-ready blockchain technologies. So that's where our budget comes from. And it's enough to have a full-time staff of about 10 people at the Linux Foundation who are focused on not only keeping the members happy and keeping them renewing each year, but also helping the technical developer communities grow and funding things like conferences. And we put on 4 times a year a developer hackfest, a face-to-face gathering of the core developers, but also open to anybody who wants to attend, as a way for people to kind of get engaged. We're running a public conference in December called the Hyperledger Global Forum, which, people will still have to pay money to go to, but it'll definitely lose money, as most first-time conferences do. And so it gives us a chance to do all the things that are normally a lot harder to do on an open source project, and yet still make the difference between good software that great software no one knows about and so no one uses, and great software plus a great movement.
So is there a token involved in your technologies? Does anyone make money on the network if they run a node or if they are they helpful in terms of executing a smart contract or anything like that?
Right. There's no there's no single token that's used across all of Hyperledger. There's no Hypercoin, and there never will be. And that's not because I don't like money or don't like making money. I could use a Lamborghini if anyone has a spare one. I'd be happy to drive that off your lot for you. But if there was, no, but it helps us avoid a certain set of conflicts of interest, right? The whole idea is here's software that it's up to you to do something useful with, right? And you can build a business on top of this software running, blockchain as a service for all these different use cases. You might even be an end user organization. Like we have members like Daimler and Airbus who are using this. So not because they're going to resell this or embed it inside of a Mercedes car or anything like that, but because they have supply chain needs, they have treasury needs, they have all these kind of use cases for applying this technology. And as sophisticated end users, they want to support the project. But right now, all of the technologies at Hyperledger are not based on using a token to fund the consensus mechanism. They're based on the idea that, hey, those 20 banks in China all stand up a node on the network and participate in whether it's Kafka or a Byzantine fault tolerant kind of consensus mechanism, something where there's intrinsic value that you get from running the network and being a node on the network, and where the volume of that doesn't require, a whole lot of CPU power in order to support a pretty high transaction rate, or at least high enough for what you need for the use case. And so of course, this does not involve the CPU burn of proof of work. So from an energy efficiency issue, it's much simpler. You can get to transaction volumes in the hundreds or even thousands of transactions per second. So it's a different economic model. I will say, though, that you can take these networks and you can tokenize assets on top of them. And you can create tokens that correlate to real world assets like diamonds or land title or bars of gold sitting in a safe if you want. You can correlate them to virtual assets like frequent flyer miles or other kinds of discount points or, that sort of thing. And you could even implement a currency system on top of this. I mean, my take is when the central banks finally do get around to issuing their own digital currencies, they'll do it on networks that look a lot more like how these networks work than look like a cryptocurrency network. And that's because, those banks will set the currency volume, they will sign these tokens, they'll float around. And actually that looks a lot like what a lot of the not the central banks, but a lot of the regional banks are doing when they sell bonds or they sell other instruments denominated in fiat currencies on these networks. But you could do your own currency on these too, right? You just don't have mining. You don't have proof of work. And I have a ton of respect for the networks that do, and I think there's a place for them and a place for a very public-facing network where you need those kinds of incentives to be able to allow anybody to come on and anonymously participate and publish. So this isn't about presenting a competitive platform to Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of the other public ledgers, but this is about saying maybe there's a more efficient way to go and solve a whole lot of the use cases in the blockchain space. And finally, I'll just end with, at the end of the day, hopefully we can make the differences between these two worlds much more of a spectrum than a binary kind of, are you there or are you there? And I think it's by looking at technologies like Interledger for linking these transactions, looking at technologies like the smart contract languages, because Ethereum smart contracts run just as well on a public blockchain as they do on a private one. And if there's a role that we can play at Hyperledger in helping bridge or help more of the public ledger technology community collaborate on code that is not coin specific, then I'd be happy to entertain that and champion that inside the rest of the project.
Great, thank you for that, Brian. So, one of the things we've heard over and over again here at Hack Summit over the last couple of days is that many of the technologies in this space are kind of bleeding edge. They haven't been fully proven yet. Good example might be proof of stake not being tested quite at scale compared to proof of work. And so given that we're not yet sure where the ecosystem will evolve yet, and it's still kind of the early days, how do you make the decision about whether it's kind of too early to quote unquote bless some of these projects via a consortium, given that we're not quite sure which projects will succeed yet at scale from an algorithm and defensibility perspective? Should we wait to see which projects kind of have organic success before we start to kind of stamp a brand on them? Like, what are your thoughts around all that?
It's a really good question. And it's really, I think it's a very different calculus of where to be on the risk versus innovation kind of spectrum when you're talking about a big global ledger with $100 billion in market cap, with companies who live and breathe on that ledger, right? And people's wallets who have, millions of dollars or billions of dollars in assets on that ledger. A very different calculus for that than it is for a consortium chain that has 10 organizations on it. Now, those 10 are going to want to also have a lot of assurance that the technology they're on works, but they have an easier time rolling back if what they've tried doesn't quite work in production. They have an easier time using human governance to correct for a bug in the system. On a public ledger, if there's a bug like the various bugs that have happened on Ethereum, which no discredit to Ethereum, like bugs are always going to exist. They're always going to happen. And the community around the community around those ledgers have a choice to make. Do they allow those bugs to have these ripple effects? No pun intended. Or do they take a hard fork? Do they back them out, as they did with the DAO hack, but did not do with the parity hack yet, right? And on a private ledger, on a consortium ledger, that debate, that conversation can be much more localized. It's really just about between the 12, or institutions there, or the 20, or even the 200. And you can use other human governance mechanisms that we know pretty well to abrogate those debates, right? And then make a call as to what should be backed out or reversed or that sort of thing. And so I've kind of forgotten the question. But I think governance models are something we're going to see innovation on for a long time. Oh, around risk reward. I think if you end up with a universe of a lot of different blockchain technologies out there, a lot of different separate ledgers with ways to tie them together, maybe ways to do discovery. I'm really a big fan of some of these projects like Cosmos and Aeon and other looks to see, can we build a blockchain of ledgers? Can we do like a backbone between them? I don't think we'll get to just one. I think we'll get to different networks that kind of overlap and compete and that sort of thing, and that's great. But I think fundamentally the underlying ledgers should be sovereign. They should be independent, and it should be up to them to decide how quickly do they turn the dial all the way to updating every day and picking up new features and picking up bug fixes and performance improvements, but also potentially picking up new bugs and new hidden like issues that they might have to address. Or do they turn the dial all the way to the other end and like update once a year only after doing 6 months of heavy load test and simulation? Or are they somewhere in between? And that's really a localized decision for people to make. And it's a lot easier to make that decision when you've got the underlying ledgers are as being very separate from each other and using all the same software underneath. Like you can use all the same software even if you're running different ledgers. It's a lot harder to be ambitious and be aggressive about rolling new features, fixing bugs, adding that sort of thing. If you have millions of people whose livelihood depends on this ledger being up, every single second of the day. So with full respect to how hard that challenge is in doing something like moving the Ethereum mainnet from proof of work to proof of stake, that's really hard. And I'm really glad that there's a lot of smart people working on that challenge. I think if we can try to take the load off their backs by moving 99% of the transaction traffic to other consortium ledgers, I think we'll do them a favor and will help the world adopt blockchain technology faster.
That's great. I was going to ask you about this. So, there's, I'm sure, a lot of politics that you guys deal with in terms of the various political wills of the players that are involved in Hyperledger. They likely sometimes have competing interests. Some vendors will want to do something. Some vendors will want to do other things because they have different motivations. Mm-hmm. And it's probably challenging to manage and kind of arbitrate all of that. Does that whole political process slow down the pace of innovation sometimes within these projects?
One thing that every open source community that's well run at least tries really hard to avoid is design by committee, or a development process that requires everybody to agree to a thing before anybody can get started. We do have just enough process to make sure that no code gets committed into Fabric, for instance, until 2 other people have signed off on it, right? To make sure that you're not introduced, to try to make sure at least that 2 more eyeballs have looked at it and there's very little risk. I mean, there's always going to be some risk, but that there's low risk that this is going to pull everything down. And combine that with continuous integration, combine that with a whole lot of unit tests and integration tests, and you are in a better spot than you might be. But these debates that happen about architecture, these debates that happen about the directions of the underlying software, we've been figuring out how to do that for 20 years now. And the lesson over and over is the more that you make it about the objective capabilities of the platform, and allow for people to make localized decisions. So, for example, we haven't had a debate like this, but if we had the blockchain, the size debate, the block size debate, like you had in Bitcoin, within a Hyperledger project, I think somebody would have said, just make it a variable. A runtime configuration variable in the software, and your deployment over here can run in 1 megabyte blocks, and your deployment over here can run in 2 megabyte blocks, and we'll see what happens, right? And the one who really wants the bigger transaction rate, at the cost of bigger node size or bigger ledger size, can see if that trade-off is worth the difference or not. That's an easier thing to do when we're not trying to just build one big ledger that handles everything. So the more experimentation we can have on the fridges, the more that these debates can be turned into configuration options rather than, life or death kind of decisions. the better, I think. The real issue is you don't want companies to come to think that they own an open source project, right? That they are the sole ones to set the direction or the term. And so we do a lot to make sure that when projects come into Hyperledger, even if they initially start from one vendor, from one company, that the entire development process is opened, that the developers themselves are trained on how to turn first to the community to get feedback, even on an idea before they start building something, and to look for every opportunity to take advantage of smart people beyond their own walls, who live outside of them, to be able to work together on a new feature, a bug fix, that sort of thing.
That's great. So it's almost like the fact that you don't have a token and there isn't money at stake almost gives you flexibility and freedom to change things quickly.
We kind of let the politics be somebody else's problem. We get a pass.
What you're essentially offering is you're offering software that organizations can use privately within their own business partner network, basically.
Right.
And if they choose to monetize that in some way, that's their decision among their private partner network. Yep. There is no token. And so because there's not money at stake, there's less of an impact if a mistake is made or if something's declared as an option rather than a requirement in the software itself.
Yes, and I mean, I just add that I think, there's always money at stake because these are real production networks eventually, right? We're playing with things here and there, and there's pilots, but now there's a couple of production systems. And you want to have at least enough confidence in the development process and in the options that you're making and the way that you're building new features to know that you're not putting people's digital assets at risk, right? And in fact, for us at Hyperledger, when a project hits 1.0, that's the signal from the developers that the project has crossed a chasm from being kind of, experimental R&D. We might break the APIs, we might make a mistake, to being now something that the developers are comfortable with people they've never met running this in production to manage real digital assets, which is a big deal, right? And so right now, Fabric and Sawtooth are the only two projects that have hit 1.0. Indy might get there someday. Burrow might get there someday. Some of the other stuff might always be zeroed out something. We'll see. But it's certainly our intent to make sure every project is on some sort of conveyor belt to like an enterprise release in some way, because that's what they need. They need to be able to use software like this in an enterprise and trust it in the same way that they trust Linux, in the same way they trusted Apache or MySQL, to just do a simple job and do it well, right?
That's great. So let's talk about self-sovereign identity. I'm glad you brought that up. So why don't you give the audience an overview of what is self-sovereign identity, the problem it's trying to solve, and also realistically, how do we get adoption of self-sovereign identity around the world?
This is a really big topic. It really, would require not only its own hour to really make most people happy, but like even a tutorial. And I'm really happy that we have a project at Hyperledger, which was brought to us by a nonprofit called the Sovereign Foundation, which you could kind of think of as trying to build kind of an ICANN for distributed digital identity, kind of a governance organization that acts as kind of an overlay, what's called a DID ledger. And Indy, Hyperledger Indy, is the software behind it. So it's like running a DNS server, all right? And then there's a third organization called the Identity Foundation, which is acting as kind of a standards body in this space. And around all three of these, there's support from a number of very large companies like Accenture and IBM and Microsoft, and a whole lot of startups that are starting to provide products and services around this. So there's a real excitement to it. But what is it? So self-sovereign identity is this idea that instead of your identity being defined as your profile at Facebook, your profile at Twitter, your profile on a government website, and where, you log in and get access to this remote stuff that's over there. And you might wake up one day and discover that it's gone, and then you're scrambling to reboot your password or something like that. Or, hey, if Twitter goes out of business, what happened to your data that was sitting there? If you were using an e-commerce website and you kept a history of your transactions there, what happened to your history when that disappears? Or worse, like you went to a good college, you have a diploma that sits on their website, and then they go out of business, the website disappears. What happens to your digital diploma, right? I mean, you get a paper one, you can scan it in, but that's not a digital document, right? So the idea with self-sovereign identity is you have something like a wallet, right? and you have a way of attaching yourself to that wallet that has to do with, a local set of crypto keys, maybe a multi-sig kind of way of identifying you if you lost things. But basically, you've got data that's locally and an identity that you manage from something very close to you. And then when you get a diploma at a college, instead of it being a record on their server over there, it comes in as a document that you hold here. And the document has signatures, and so a distributed ledger is used to keep things like keys and hashes and other things that would allow me to then show this diploma to you, and you would be able to verify that all of the signatures match and that it was really issued at this time, and I would record in the ledger in some encrypted way that I've shared this document with you, and because I'm applying for a job from you. But, if I didn't get the job, and now I can pull that permission back. And that sense of agency over who I've shared the data with is one of the key concepts in this space. It's one of the key things that keeps this, right now when you share data with a website, you have no idea what they do with it. They go off and they run with it. With self-sovereign identity, you keep that history. And in that consent of sharing that data, they don't have the consent to share that data onward with a data broker or, Facebook or anybody else. And you can withdraw that consent as well. So it finally gives people agency over their data and a sense of ownership, a sense of, I'm giving this to you now because we have some business relationship we're going to work out, or I want to apply for a job or something. But when you're done with it, I get to pull it back. And I don't, pulling it back, there's no really digital way to be able to delete data off your server. But the real way is to record the granting and then the withdrawal of the consent in a ledger of some sort. So that's the big idea. And you can apply that to passports and diplomas. You could apply it to healthcare records, financial records. You could apply it to other very personal data, but you could also apply it to digital assets that you store on all these different ledgers. And so it's how we tie together your identities across all these different ledgers and do that in a way that is privacy preserving at the same time. And there's a lot of interesting zero knowledge proof crypto that's used to show you, if I've got a diploma on this ledger and I'm applying to a process on this ledger, to make the tie there, allow you to trust this information without knowing my identity on that other ledger, and thus able to correlate a lot of data. So again, lots more to talk about, but I'm excited about it. A lot of people in the space are excited because it seems to be a way to actually use digital tools and use signatures, use cryptography in a way that is privacy preserving without just like shutting down the internet and saying no more Facebook, right? Like it actually could allow you to still have social networks, still have digital processes, but actually reclaim a sense of sovereign agency over this. And the nice thing is, that you've probably heard of this regulation called the GDPR in the European Union, which was also kind of they describe it as the peasants with pitchforks storming the Bastille kind of moment of like, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it when it comes to how companies presume that they can use your data without your consent in all sorts of ways, right? And this model for how to manage personal data, if it's done right, and we do it right in Indy and Sovereign, I really believe, if it's done right, it's done in a way that is entirely not only GDPR compatible, but if businesses just pick up this new approach, then they don't have to like reconfigure a lot of other ways of working. They can be GDPR compatible for free. And I think we're going to see the GDPR set a set of rules across the world for how to manage personal data. And so it feels like the time is right for this kind of thing.
And how do we get adoption in a practical sense of self-sovereign identity? Because there's a chicken and the egg problem here where unless a website or a service accepts a self-sovereign identity, it's not really useful to me to use a self-sovereign identity unless I can use it in a lot of different places.
So there's a couple of pilots out there of Indy, and there's a couple of other approaches, Uport, which is an Ethereum-specific technology, and a couple of others as well in the blockchain space. But right now, one of the challenges is that the end-user interface for a lot of these systems is pretty lousy. We need a better wallet, and this is where I could really use help. We could really use help from developers out there. We need people building essentially the equivalent of the web browser for this space. I think the digital asset space and the wallet space is to the Web 3.0 what the web browser was to Web 2.0, right? And there are a bunch of wallet platforms out there now, some of which are very specific to a given exchange, cryptocurrency exchange, or others that are very specific to certain tokens. But we need a wallet that can span the gamut from being like a better password manager for a web browser on one end and being a cryptocurrency management tool on the other end. And in between, you've got your digital identities on these different systems and the digital assets like a wallet, or I'm sorry, like a diploma or a healthcare record that correlate to those identities. And so please, if there's anyone out there who understands user experience, user identity, we have a wallet project at Indy you could throw in on. It's still very simple, but I'm hoping to, I've got a couple of calls into the cavalry to help with this problem. There are people out there who know how to build consumer UIs, but it's a hard problem, and that I think is the biggest barrier right now.
That's very well said, Brian. So we have time for just maybe a couple of audience questions here. So let's see. The first question, I think we mostly answered this, which is what are the main differences between Hyperledger and a distributed permissionless blockchain like Bitcoin? I think we pretty much covered that ground pretty well. Would you agree, Brian? Anything you want to add to that?
I think so. I just want to make sure people understand, like, Bitcoin and Ethereum are trying to solve really hard problems and are really useful. And this is really a complement to that. This is a slightly different approach. And I think the future is going to be full of both kinds of technologies.
Yeah, I mean, in a nutshell, basically, with a public ledger like Bitcoin or Ethereum, you're going to have a token. It's going to be incentivized. It's not just software that you can use for your own private purposes. And Hyperledger is squarely in that second camp. So let's say,
and hopefully it's really just a spectrum between them. Hopefully we learn a lot from each other too.
Mm-hmm. Next question from Baharat is, considering that Hyperledger is a permissioned blockchain where consensus is between trusted parties, what is the main benefit over using blockchain over just a database, which is so much easier?
Absolutely, it's easier. Absolutely, it's cheaper. Absolutely, it's more scalable to have a central database in the middle of any network of end users of applications. But that gives that central database a tremendous amount of power, right? Because if you have root on that central database, you can change anything in that data. And even if you're publishing like a Merkle tree, like hashes out about the data that you've collected, you still have a tremendous ability to influence and sway how that market works. You still have fundamental control, right? You can also rate limit other participants. You can block people. You basically, you can disempower everybody. And that's the kind of effect that we're trying to fight here. We're trying to make it possible, eventually, like one judgment, one criteria that you could apply to, because there is a governing entity who, and the metaphor I've used is, they are still, they are the ones who permit the other participants onto the network. They set the technical rules, right? They say, we're going to use this protocol. You have to have a server of this class. Here's how you run it. And some governance rules as well. What happens when somebody, follows the technical rules, but still finds a way to steal money or to front run the market, or just be a DDoS or an abusive participant? How do we correct for that? And so the metaphor that I use to describe these governing entities is that they're kind of like a referee on a football field, which is great and like a fun metaphor and like people get it. But what happens if the referee goes bad, right? Like what happens if the referee starts inventing rules of their own, or kicking players off for no good reason, or charging people $1 million to be on the field? You have to be able to fire the ref. You have to be able to say, for that network to come to an agreement that ref is no longer any good, and kick them out. And so the design of the permissioned blockchain ledger and the governance rules on it should allow for that referee to be kicked out, so that and somebody else to be swapped in, without everybody losing their assets that they've developed on that ledger.
Very well said. I'll just give a case study from my own observation. So there's a company out there called the Codex Protocol, and this is a distributed ledger solution for the auction industry for art and collectibles. So the idea here is that you've got these auction houses that will auction off coins and collectible cars and antique cars and art and things like that. And these auction houses don't necessarily get along with one another. They're competitors with each other. Mm-hmm. But it would be kind of nice to have a system of record to show, hey, this piece of art was sold 5 years ago, and now we've reacquired that art. Now it's being sold to another party, and this is the authentic history of this piece of art. That would be valuable information for the auction houses to have. But none of them really want to share that information with one another because they're all competitors. But right. If there was maybe a system of record on the blockchain where a consortium of these auction houses got together, maybe they could agree on using that system of record, as long as no one auction house was in control of it.
Right. Exactly. That's a really good example.
So we'll wrap up here with one last question from Scott, and this is a very long question to answer, but maybe you can give us like the brief answer, which is what is the broad overview of each of the Hyperledger tools and their purpose and their language? Maybe is there just like a quick like 1 sentence on each just to get the audience excited?
First off, I'll say come and visit us at hyperledger.org. We do as best a job we can as to describe the differences between them. Some of them are very crisp, like Indy is about identity, Burrow is about the Ethereum virtual machine, Quilt is about interoperability between ledgers, cross-ledger transactions, Cello is about managing a cluster of these blockchains. Fabric, Sawtooth, and Iroha are all ways of building very different kinds of distributed ledgers of blockchains. And so you really have to dive in, spend an hour with each of them, or just roll the die, pick one, and like dive in and we have tutorials. We have lots of ways to learn how to get started with each of these. So all I'd say is come in, let us know. And, and if you have a first time experience and you think of ways that we could improve that first user experience, please let us know by either posting to the list or emailing me personally if you want, Behlendorf at hyperledger.org, or info@hyperledger.org, any of the addresses. We'd love to hear from you. We all want you to be involved.
That's awesome, guys. I hope you guys get involved. And one last question from me, this is a personal question for you, Brian, which is, one of the things that you're known for in your personal life is that you are an active contributor and participant in the Burning Man community. And I admire that you are involved in that. And I think a lot of our audience doesn't know what that is. So do you want to just give a quick overview of what that is, just so that they can learn more about that in case they decide they're curious and want to just explore new avenues in their lives?
Well, if they type Burning Man into Google or YouTube or just about any search engine out there, they'll find a lot more than I can tell them in 30 seconds. But I've been going since 1995, most years. I miss a few here or there. But Burning Man is the largest participatory arts festival on the planet. And it's kind of like an open source project. It's like, here's this big canvas. What can we build together? Like show up, do some amazing lights and art and burn it all on Sunday night and head home and do it again a year later, right? And not only is it a great way to like connect technology and art and community, but for a lot of people who've been, it can be a transformative experience. It can also suck because it's pretty dusty, so some people don't have a great time, but it's definitely one of the things that people should try to do at some point in their lives.
That's awesome. I agree with you. And I've been to Burning Man myself. I went once, and it was one of the best experiences of my life, so I can agree with that. So check it out online. Well, Brian, it was a pleasure having you here. We really learned a lot, and I'm so grateful for your time. I know how busy you are running Hyperledger. And audience, we're going to be back in just a few minutes with Eli Ben-Sasson, who is the co-founding scientist of Zcash, and he has a new startup called Starkware, and he's actually going to teach us about a new technology for zero-knowledge proofs called ZK Starks, which he helped to invent. And so stick around. You're going to learn a lot. It's going to be super interesting. It's going to get your brain on fire. So hope you guys hang out here. And thanks again, Brian, for all your time today.
Yep. Thank you.